any kind, Vicky will let me know. I apologize if that's the case. Hopefully my screen is being shared right now and everything's working okay. So thanks for joining us, everybody. As Vicky said, my name's Bryce. I'm one of the co-founders of Innerlogic, which is a cultural analytics company, which is quite new, based in Halifax, Nova Scotia. I'm also a mental performance consultant with the Canadian Olympic team. I have been for the past 8 or 9 years. And I wanted to share some of those experiences with you, that hopefully can transfer and apply to some of the contexts and organizations that you're working in and leading in. I know that there's some similarities between sport and business. There's also a few differences, so we'll just have to keep those in mind as we move forward. But I did want to share primarily some stuff from my experiences with some of these teams that you see on the screen here now. So to give you some context, so my key job is mental performance consultant or coach, and that does require a lot of work with the athletes themselves in terms of one-on-one skill building and whatnot. But a second part of my job is actually being a culture consultant for these teams. And so I'm kind of put in a lead position in terms of directing things like our common purpose, our identity, our vision, and we'll get into these things as we go through the presentation. Some of the key experiences I've had in my life and in my career in this space, you can see on the screen. I've had the great privilege of attending lots of world championships with a lot of different teams and programs. I've worked with athletes and teams who have won gold medals at a world championship, and then some who have fallen short and had lots of adversity and maybe didn't cope so well with some of the pressure. I've kind of seen everything in between. But my primary job is with our women's national basketball team, and that's the team that you see there in the middle. We did recently just qualify for Tokyo, which obviously has an asterisk beside it right now, but nonetheless, we're pretty excited about a lot of things we did between the last Olympics and this one to put us in the position that we're in right now, and ultimately get the highest world ranking that we've ever had, right now sitting at 4th in the world. So I wanted to share this picture with you, and this is a picture of Kia Nurse, who's one of the key players on our team. And this picture is from August 2016. And there's a couple of things to note from this picture. You do see the body language of Kia represents what happened in this game. This was the quarterfinal of the Olympics in Rio. And you see in the background 2 French players celebrating what was obviously a huge win for them. And I share this image because it was probably a week after this event happened, after this day that you're looking at right now, that I received a pretty urgent phone call from the folks at Canada Basketball looking for a new solution to help fix some issues that they were having and that they felt caused what is looked at as a pretty serious underperformance in this game. You can see on the right side sort of a analytical view at how this game went by quarter and points over time. And what you see here is things going quite well for Team Canada up until about the halfway point, and then specifically that blue French line crosses over and intersects with the Canadian line in the 4th quarter when the pressure is the highest, the adversity is the highest, and our performance was the worst. I wasn't with the team at the time. I was just getting the call to say, is there something that we can do to help a group that seems to be misaligned, disconnected, and really not coping well with pressure and adversity? And how can we do that over the span of the next 4 and what has now become a 5-year time period? So when I took on this task, there's a few things that I had to think about as foundational elements. And one of those things was the stages of culture alignment, because anytime that you're going in to try and shift or influence a culture, you have to really get a sense of where things are in the present before making any assumptions. And so I wanted to share some of the stages of culture alignment that really mattered to me, and I think will matter to me forever moving forward, as sort of a simplified look at what's going on. So if we start at the far left, we have disorder, and disorder is where people are misaligned and they're actually unaware of what's causing the misalignment. So everyone's kind of going in their own direction, and not everyone is actually aware of the direction that the person next to them is going in, or what that person believes should be happening, or what that person believes is causing issues or is going wrong. So this is kind of just complete disorder. This is actually not the stage that this group was in. This group was in more of the individual stage. And the individual stage is where people are misaligned. So people are going in different directions, but they're actually aware of the direction that the other people are going in, and they know it's not the same as their own. So what I kind of stepped into was, some people thought that this was the problem. Some people thought we should go that way. Some people thought that it was this person's fault. And it results in total misalignment with some pretty acute awareness of what's causing that. So my job over, the 4-year period that I've been with the team is to take a group from what was in an individual stage to, hopefully the coordinated stage by kind of the midway point. The coordinated stage is where you're aligned in the sense that you're all facing the same direction. So we're kind of viewing it the same way. We're going after the same thing. We feel that this is the way we should go. And we're aware that everyone's different in that process, but at least we're all pointing the same way. It doesn't mean we all have the exact same beliefs or same personalities or anything like that, or same experiences. It just means we agree that this is where we need to go, and we're kind of side by side in that. In the later stages of this, you want to move up to this final phase, which is the collective phase. And this phase is where you're aligned, you're all pointing in the same direction, and you're strategic. And the strategic part is really key, because that's where you start to identify roles, responsibilities, who's doing what, who's best suited for what. And then you get into that kind of phase of acceptance, where people actually accept the roles that they're in and kind of file in where they should fit for the group to achieve its best results. So my task over, the past 4.5 years now has really been to go from individual to collective. And I'll share some insights as to how we approached that. I also had to consider what I believe are the 3 laws of culture. It's like the laws of physics. It's just going to ring true in every case, in every group, and every team that you're in. Law 1 is that culture is constant. So you don't get to decide if you have a culture, you only get to decide what the culture is. You have a lot of influence over the what, but no matter what, you're going to have a culture. So if you put no effort in, if you do nothing at all, you could end up with a culture of apathy. And that's the culture that you've accepted now, simply because you haven't put much effort in. Bottom line is, it's constant. You're gonna have some culture. It's just a matter of how intentional and deliberate you want to be. In my experience, people kind of act like water. They just take the shape of what you put them into to a large degree. So what we put these players and staff and everybody into in terms of the environment has a really big influence on what that constant culture is going to equate to. Number 2 is, culture happens gradually, and then boom, suddenly, it's front and center. But the really key part here is the gradual part. It's sort of a compounding of really small social, emotional signals and actions that kind of eventually come to a head in some big moment that highlights and makes everything super visible as to how strong your culture really has been over this long compounding period of time, where little things add up to make a big difference. And the suddenly moment is kind of what I showed in that picture with Kia, where 4 years, you kind of notice things aren't going the way they should, and people are kind of going in different directions and have different beliefs and aren't really aligned. And then suddenly the 4th quarter hits of the Olympic quarterfinal, and it shows up, right? All of these little things have compounded into a big deficiency. The 3rd law is that culture impacts results. This is just a fact. I've witnessed it. I've experienced it in every case I've ever been involved in, every team I've ever worked with. In fact, in the corporate industry, there's lots of good research on this, that culture can can have up to a 50% impact on results when you measure things like alignment within teams, within certain companies. So there is a quantifiable element to this where, you know, the constant culture that exists, the gradual things that happen slowly over time will suddenly show up and have a really big impact on results. And I know that lots of teams that work in the Olympic space have witnessed this firsthand. So there's a couple of key questions that, you know, I ask myself and that I ask the people involved, you know, the collective group of people involved trying to move something forward when it comes to culture. And the three questions that I've narrowed in on are this: who are we? Where are we going? And why are we going there? And if we make these a little more directed and give them titles, I would define this first question as culture. So who are we, this cultural identity piece? Who are we on a day-to-day basis? What are those gradual things that make up our team, our fingerprint as a group? That's culture. The second piece, and you can kind of see in the background there, you know, the image of a compass, is vision. Where are we going? Like, what is our North Star? What do we all agree is the most important destination for us to go? And then how clearly can we show that, articulate that? How clearly can we communicate that on a daily basis to serve as sort of this anchoring, motivating factor that keeps us moving in that direction? And then last but not least is, why are we going there? And in the background there, you see a heart, because that's about purpose, like in service of what? So what do we really care about? Like what are we doing this? Why are we doing this? What are we doing this for? And does that strike us in an emotional way where we feel like it's important, it's meaningful, right? I'm doing this with my heart, not just my head because it's logical, because it actually has some meaning to me. So these are things that kind of serve as a blueprint when you move forward in trying to build a high performance culture, to shift things in the right direction. These things are all at play. Now, the first most important part of this is culture, is this fingerprint of who are we? How do we behave on a daily basis? Because we know if we follow the laws of culture, that's going to happen gradually, and then eventually it's going to impact our results. So little things are not to be ignored. In my view, there's a pretty simple but not easy, which is an important distinction. There's a simple equation for this process. And the equation is made up of three things: personalities, environment, and leadership. When you think of personalities, you think of you know, those innate tendencies that make up the people involved, those things that you know, stick with them for long periods of time. It's kind of who they are, and that can become a puzzle to try and fit these things together. You hear sports broadcasters all the time say, whoa, a lot of strong personalities on that team, as if it's a challenge, because it is. You know, fitting personalities together is not easy. Now, once you go from personalities across to the right, another important thing to notice is that the level of influence that you have over these things starts to change from left to right. So as we slide over to environment, and we've already kind of talked about environment. Environment is that space that everybody exists in on a day-to-day basis, has a huge effect. It can dictate up to 70% of behavior, as suggested in various studies over the past couple of years. When you shift over to environment, you go from personality, where you have a very low level of influence. People are who they are. It's very difficult to change that. They change very slowly, if at all, over time. Over to environment, where you actually have a pretty high level of influence. And if you slide over to the right again, over to leadership, you have an even higher level of influence. The environment is quite complex. There's lots of variables to it, so it's a little harder to control and influence. Whereas leadership is normally a really defined amount of people. Sometimes it's one person, sometimes it's a small group of people, aligning those people is what you have the most influence over. So, these are three things that are constantly at play with each other when it comes to trying to figure out what is that moving target of culture and how do you pin it down. I think this is a really important place to start. Another quick thing to notice here is these things don't work in isolation. So personalities will have an influence on the environment, depending on what personalities you put in there. It's not a massive influence, but they will have an influence. And the environment will certainly have an effect on personalities. And this happens kind of across the board. They're definitely not things that work in isolation. And we'll talk about this a little bit further as we go through. So let's just break these down a teeny bit more so we really understand why these things are so critical to culture building. So there's a great book called Personality, What Makes You the Way You Are. And this is one of the most user-friendly reads I've come across when it comes to personality research and knowledge. It's super insightful, good for anybody. And one of the pieces I've captured from this book for the presentation is that talking about someone's personality is just a shorthand way for talking about the way that person's particular nervous system is wired up. And these traits are reliable and they're stable over really long periods of time. So let's look at what some of these traits are and how they influence culture a little bit. So when we talk about personality, from an Innerlogic standpoint, we're always referencing personality in terms of the big 5 personality traits. There's a lot of personality tools out there. Totally understand that, but if anyone who's listening to this is interested in using personality or has used personality in the past, there's a few really important things to consider in this space that kind of don't get the attention they deserve in the mainstream market, I would say. Before I share those, let's just look at what these are. So the big 5 traits are agreeableness, conscientiousness, extroversion, openness to experience, and emotionality. Now, the research shows that these are by far the most reliable traits in all personality assessment research. So that's an important point. But an even more important point is there's a lot of products out there right now that use categories instead of spectrums. So it'll say you're a blank. If you think about this logically, that actually makes no sense, because personality is kind of like height and weight. Like we all have some degree of it, but it would never be accurate to just say, well, that person's short and that person's tall. Like what level of information does that really give you? So what's really key is to look at personality as things on a spectrum. So we all have components of every trait you see on the screen, and they all exist on a spectrum. Some of us have more, some of us have less, but no one is just purely extroverted. So when you hear someone say, oh, that person's an extrovert, well, they actually have introverted tendencies as well, right? There's no one who's a 100% extrovert. That person would surely go insane if that was the life that they were living. No one is 100% conscientiousness. There's variant levels of this that we all kind of have, and that's important to consider. And the reason I share this is because the accuracy and the utility of this line of research, like personality research, when you use it properly, opens up a really important question about roles in a team. So I wanted to look at the different types of roles in a team and how they affect culture. On the left, you see functional. On the right, you see social. In any group and in any team or culture you're working in right now as part of your day-to-day life, day-to-day job, your functional role is your actual technical role. So in our space, that's, like a point guard, right? In the basketball world, your functional role is you're a point guard. For you, maybe you're a sales rep or something like that. That's a role. But on the other side, we have the social role. And the social role within a team is that dynamic role, how you contribute to the dynamic of an overall team vibe and team cohesion. So a dynamic role could be you're an energy provider. You're more likely to be an energy provider, and you see in the background two of our players who are high energy providers, Miranda and Nat, because they're more extroverted than some others. You may also be a listener. That's another social role. Maybe you're just a really good listener, and people on your team around you start to notice, geez, I really like talking to that person. They're a really good listener. These two roles are really key because they actually, when you look at the evidence behind them, they have about the same amount of influence on performance. Mostly because in today's world, people don't get stuff done, teams do, right? Almost every job that you enter now is a team-based job, especially, even in a sport that's considered individual, is really a team-based sport because you have staff that you have to work with, you have training partners who push you every day. So the social elements of this is really, really key. So this then opens up kind of another dynamic when it comes to personality, which is a choice that you almost have to make. And sometimes it's just something that you have to deal with within your team. And it lies on a spectrum that goes from compatibility to balance. And I want you to think of compatibility as likeness. So how many of us are the same? So if we all had a personality profile in front of us, how many of us share the same types of traits, and we all fall kind of in the same places on those spectrums from the Big Five personality assessment? That would be compatibility. A lot of like-minded people who function the same way. On the other side, we have balance, and you can think of balance as disparity. So there's a lot of different types of people and personalities within the room. So if you have some, let's say you work on a team that lands like here, so you're weighted way more towards the compatibility side. That basically means that you have a lot of people on your team or in your environment or in your culture that are like-minded. Maybe you have a lot of people who score really high on conscientiousness or openness to experience. And that feels good because they're like me. So you constantly have that vibe of, wow, they're just kind of like me and we like the same things. However, some things to be aware of here is, those few people on the team that aren't like that can very quickly feel alienated on these types of teams. So if you have a group of people, 9 of 10 people are very like-minded in certain ways, that one person can quickly feel like an outsider in the group, and their ideas don't get heard, and they have a hard time connecting with this group of people. So that can create some conflict and some cohesion issues. Now, if we weight this the other way, if you're on a team that has really good balance, so you have lots of different personality types in the group, there's challenges and advantages to that as well. So, one of the challenges would be decisions take a really long time to get made because there's so many different viewpoints. On the flip side, if you're super compatible, you got lots of groupthink. We slide back over to balance. If you're weighted all the way down there, you've got, like how many different, it's like a committee at all times. How many different views do we have to absorb here before we make a decision? Now, at the same time, it creates a space where there's lots more creativity and innovation because you do have a lot more challenging thoughts and you have people who operate in different ways. So whenever we're selecting a team, and we've just gone through, the final stages, and we still have one stage left in terms of team selection for the Olympics coming up in 2021, you really have to be conscious of what you need. If we go back to functional versus social, maybe we need a backup post player, but maybe there's 2 backup post players who share the same functional role, but have very different social roles. Maybe one of them's an energy provider and maybe one of them's a listener. So we have to think about, well, what do we need in this group? Like, what's the dynamic of our group now? And what do we want to insert into it that is going to account for this social dynamic that's created by different personality types? They both play the same functional role quite well. We need to think about other things. If we skip ahead to this slide one more time, and you look at that openness to experience bubble, it's really big for a reason. So what I'm trying to represent there is, let's say this is a team makeup that you're looking at in front of you. and you've got a team that has really high openness to experience, but really low conscientiousness. So what you're going to get in that group is, wow, we love ideas. We love doing new things. We love trying new things. You look at the Toronto Raptors, Nick Nurse has created a space where openness to experience is a really key variable because they try new defenses on the fly. They put things in between games. They do things that have not been done before that seem outside of the box, but the group as a whole is open to this. That could be good. It could also have some downsides. If you look at the conscientiousness bubble, and conscientiousness is like, attention to detail, being really thoughtful and pragmatic. Maybe the fact that you have not a lot of that is something to consider when adding a new member to your team. You might need more conscientiousness to balance this out than just adding more openness to experience, because that other person is going to challenge some of those ideas, which is exactly what you may need in this team. We don't want everyone just agreeing with everything all the time. If we move forward in this equation and we get to part 2, if you think back to the culture equation, the second component of that was environment. So I want to share some things about the science of environment, about our environment as a team that hopefully can apply in your space somehow. And I've taken a quote here from a book called Legacy by James Kerr. This is an awesome resource. This is about the New Zealand All Blacks and the type of culture that they create. I would highly recommend this book to anyone interested in the space of culture, leadership, and building a high performance environment. What I've snagged from this book is a quote that says, "Leaders design and create an environment that drives the high performance behaviors needed for success. If you establish a culture higher than that of your opposition, you will win." This is the philosophy of the All Blacks. So rather than obsessing about results, focus on the team. I snagged this quote because I really believe in it. I agree with it. And the fact that they've lived this for such a long period of time and it's led to so many great results is really good evidence that it has some merit. So let's talk about environment and how to kind of process the way to shape an environment. We can think of it this way. Your environment equals your values communicated. Now, I know that, having core values as a group it's almost cliche at this point, and I'll address that in a few more slides, but nonetheless, they do matter. So the shared values matter. So let's take a look at what this means. If we break this down and your environment equals your values communicated, your values are that set of shared, distinct assumptions and beliefs within your particular team. So they're quite distinctive to your group and your team. And if we look at communicated, those are those artifacts and behaviors that reinforce your values. So think of artifacts as things that you can put up and be visual with, making these things come to life. I'll show you some examples on the next slide. And then behaviors are those day-to-day upholding of things that this group claims to believe in. As soon as you stop upholding the things that you say you value, your culture is pivoting and starting to work against you, because people will lose faith in the process. They don't believe it's real. They don't believe people actually believe in it, and therefore they're way more likely to just go their own path. That's how you get all the way back to that stage of disorder or individual. As soon as these things stop being communicated, you're highly, highly susceptible to being in that phase, disorder or individual. If we look at how the All Blacks do this, they've got some really clear values and they've got some really clear ways of communicating them. So bringing them to life. So if we just take the first one as an example, one of the top values of the All Blacks is responsibility. The way that gets communicated is sweeping the shed, which is basically this kind of act and tradition that they have, where it doesn't matter who you are, how senior you are in the team, you clean up the locker room. We all clean up the locker room all the time. We leave it in a better place. And if you go down the list, unity, effort, discipline, respect, they've come up with these really clear ways to articulate and communicate the values that they have. If you do not take this step, so if values go uncommunicated, let's say that's what the equation says now, values uncommunicated, you're going to go back to a stage of culture that's really difficult to shift out of. You're going to likely go back to disorder or individual. So let's look at some of our values as a team. So as Team Canada, over the past 4 years, as we've tried to make some radical shifts and focused heavily, obsessively on the communicated part. The value part is not so hard, right? Like coming up with things that are worthy and contribute to performance and the group believes in, it actually isn't the hardest part of the process. It's very common, for instance, for us, we didn't have anyone who was against togetherness. People believe in that. Our team believed in that when we went through the process, engaged the athletes, engaged all the staff in establishing our values. There wasn't much resistance against togetherness. In fact, there's a lot of support. But how do we communicate it? How does it become obvious that it's who we are, right? Because that's what this all goes back to, is that concept that culture is who we are. You're asking the question, who are we? Well, to answer it, you have to create these signals. So if we look at togetherness, one of our signals is we link arms for every anthem, no matter what. If the anthem is playing, we're linking. Even if we're not playing in a game, we're actually supporting another team at the Pan Am Games here, our women's softball team. The anthem comes on and we're linked. No one has to tell our players or staff to do this. It's just something we agreed is important to represent togetherness. In a game, same thing. This is our final against Argentina in 2017 to make it on to the next phase. Anthem plays, we're linked. Not a lot of other teams do this, so it actually stands out as quite a significant symbol. If we go deeper into the environment, again, we're just valuing togetherness. We never sit with hierarchy. We always sit in a semicircle. Everyone has an equal say in this room. Everyone should be able to make eye contact with the other person. When we're discussing things, you see on the screen, it's offensive transition. So our head coach, Lisa Tomaitis, is actually preparing us for offensive transition here. This is an important task, an important meeting. And we take the time to get in there and set up the room in a way that represents togetherness before everybody comes in. We also all help with all bags all the time, whether they're coming off an airplane, a bus, it doesn't matter. Everyone's involved. You see Patrice, our trainer, you see Steve, the assistant coach up there. In fact, I'm probably running a risk here just by taking a photo, but I was in there as well. So everybody's contributing. You see Carly Clark, our other assistant on the right. Get involved. We're together all the time. There's no difference between you or I when it comes to putting in the work. We also don't have cell phones at meals. If we want to, connect and share stories and make eye contact with each other and start to learn about each other, we can't have cell phones out at meals. It's the only time of the day where we don't support the use of cell phones. All other times, other than during training, is totally fine, but we want to have a family feel when it comes to meals. And this has been a really significant one for us. It shows up at competitions big time. World Championships, there was 7 teams eating in the meal hall all at one time. And we were the only team hanging out with each other, actually talking. Everybody else was on their phone. We create a space for us to be together wherever we go. We call it our family room because, we see ourselves as a family. We spend a lot of time on the road. This stuff takes time. It takes effort. It takes planning. It's built into the schedule. It's very intentional. You know who's involved in this, what their roles are, but we're going to get it done. So we put up Canada stuff. We make everything as red as it can be. We have a TV. We'll find a way. It doesn't always look this nice. Sometimes it's in a smaller hotel room, but we will find a way to have a place where our people can collide with one another just naturally because we want to be together. We value mindfulness. So if you really value something, you have to build it in to your environment. So we build it in not just into Having mindfulness sessions, like you can see in this photo, we build it right into warm-up, because warm-up is something that's important. We're preparing our mind and our body to perform. So if we really value something, it should exist. So we put mindfulness right into our warm-up. You see Nat, who's a WNBA player currently, has been for a while, doing some mindfulness in our warm-up. We also set up mindfulness sessions in the hotel. It just isn't going to change your culture if you just say to people, you know what, mindfulness matters, we value it, everyone go do it on your own time. We can actually be together while doing our mindfulness. We value competitiveness. If we want to really be competitive, we have to bring it to life in everything that we do, not just the few times a week where we get to play scrimmages against one another or, you know, do intense things in training. We want to be competitive all the time, right? We want to win at everything that we're doing. So we build competitiveness into our warm-up. It doesn't have to be basketball. It can be fun. Sometimes we play games like this. Sometimes we play a little touch football. But if we value it, we're going to find a way to communicate it. If we can't communicate it, then it shouldn't be a value. I share this one sort of as a special one because there's a really unique story associated with this. So we value being prepared. You know, being prepared is a really high value for us. It's key to our success. And so in our locker room, we'll actually project our scout of the other team, which we've gone through a number of times, both individually and in a meeting, on the wall of the locker room. We'll put it up as posters or we'll project it, whatever's the best way to do it. Because if we value it, it's got to be in there. It's got to be communicated, right? This is the last hour before a game. If someone wants to take note of what the other team looks like and what their tendencies are, we're going to give them that chance. What's really key about this is when you ask a player to look at the scout and go through the video on their own, you do get a different sort of set of people execute that in different ways, some better than others. And so we wanted to create an environment that just people get absorbed in this. And what happened in this case was when it's up on the wall, when 2 or 3 of your key players walk up there and they start looking at it and having a conversation about it. And that's what we observed was our key players going, yeah, so she's going to do this. And yeah, she's going to do that. The players who may not give it a close look when we send it out individually take notice. And now the environment is starting to shift their behavior, right? So at the very start, I said, people are like water. They take the shape of what you pour them into. Well, we poured some people into an environment that was so committed to being prepared that they had no choice but to be so. And they got interested and more excited when they saw the veteran players getting involved in that. So the key takeaway from this is it's easier to change the environment than the person. If we think back to the personality discussion, personality traits matter. They're strong, they exist, they predict behavior, they predict performance in some ways. They're pretty stable, right? So again, you're not trying to change those traits necessarily. You do want to use that information to have as much understanding and information about the type of group that you have, some of the challenges you might run into, some of the people you might need to insert into that group to help that group have better balance. While at the same time, when you slide over to environment, you can create an environment that has some level of positive influence regardless of personality, right? So if we know we can't change the people, maybe there's something else we can change that will get the results that we need. And in this case, it's the environment. So if we look at a mediocre versus a high performance environment, there's a few things that really stick out. And mediocre environments are the most common. There's very few terrible environments, especially at some of the higher levels, but there's a whole lot of mediocre environments, just a lot of average going on. In the mediocre category, you put words on a wall and then you forget about them. We see it all the time. You come up with some values, a sheet goes out or they go up on the locker room wall once, and then you don't live them, you don't communicate them, you don't put in the effort to make them real and distinct. Number 2, values and behaviors are very rarely reinforced or discussed. Okay, so someone does something that's counter to what the values are, and no one calls them out. No one mentions it. No one brings it up. You don't create a system to have these discussions. Your culture is going to revert back to individual or disorder. And third, you rely on an external party to build it and own it. So someone else comes in and says, here's what your culture should be like, and here's what everything, all the research on culture, and do this and do that. And so they've then built it. You haven't empowered everybody from the inside out to have their voice in the mix, which is so key for their motivation. And then at the same time, who's going to own that when that person leaves, right? So if it's me, if it's someone else, it doesn't matter. If it's someone who's not in your group, your culture is going to start to fail when that person leaves, because no one's really empowered and supporting those notions for you. On the other side, it's really simple. Everyone walks the walk, relentless reinforcement, to the point where at the beginning it's a little bit obnoxious, maybe annoying, maybe over the top, but it's real. Relentless reinforcement. And number three is, the people involved are the ones who build it and the ones who own it. Maybe they get some facilitation or advice from other places, but they have to feel like it's literally theirs. The last piece of the puzzle that I shared in the culture equation. So quick reminder, we went from personality, low influence, over to environment, high influence, and now we're over to leadership, which is extremely high influence. Developing a leadership model, and this is from a book called Touch Points, which again, I obviously wouldn't put a book up here if I didn't love it and didn't want to suggest it. Developing a leadership model is one of the most practical, energy-saving, and stress-reducing things you can do as a leader. That's because the clearer your thinking becomes, the less others will waste their time wondering how you might approach things. This is so, so, so true. I wanted to share with you what I believe is the most important takeaway. Trying to sum up a couple of key points on leadership in a fairly tight presentation is challenging. This should be a whole workshop in and of itself. But if there's one or two things that I could share as it relates to what type of leadership builds the best culture, it's this. It's called transformational leadership, and it's made up of 4 pillars. The 4 pillars are confidence, so believing in your people, genuinely trying to help them grow, believing that they have what it takes to add value to the team, and letting them know, inspiring them to take action because they know you believe in them. Confidence is absolutely key in transformational leadership. Number 2 is connection. So this is taking a person-centered approach. Focus on the people before you focus on any results. A general rule of thumb here is that connection precedes commitment. Every leader wants people to be committed to them, be committed to me and this and what we're trying to do and my leadership. But what they forget is, to get to commitment, you need to have connection. Connection is that precursor that's always there, right? Kind of just sitting in between. And connection is based on very simple things, right? Things like having conversations about things other than work. One of the rugby coaches I've worked with said, as he's the head coach of our women's national team in the sport of rugby, he said, if I get stuck in the elevator with anyone, a staff or an athlete who's part of our program, and we don't have a bunch of things to talk about other than rugby, I've failed. If all I have to talk about with them is rugby, I've failed. So finding a way to be connected, right? Genuinely connected to that person. Beside that, we have competence, right? So involve people in the process. There's nothing worse that you can do for a culture as a leader than try and make all the big decisions yourself behind closed doors and then say, and you guys go execute. People don't feel involved. They're lacking context. They're lacking motivation in the plan. Finally, we have character. And character is really simple. It's just about practicing what you preach. If we've got a set of values, if we've got a way of doing things around here that you've committed to, that you've communicated as a coach, you have to practice them. There's nothing more culture busting than saying we're one thing and the leader doing something else. So saying, you know what, we really value togetherness, and then the coach being on their cell phone at the meal. That's a culture buster, right? A leader saying that we value your wellness and your well-being, but I'm going to work you to the bone and not listen to you when you say you're overworked. You have to practice what you preach. So this is called transformational leadership. I highly advise, looking into this more. If you're curious, there's lots of great content and research about this topic. It's also important to note that sort of the antonym to transformational leadership is a really common form of leadership called transactional leadership. And transactional leadership is based primarily on punishments and rewards. So you do you do it one way, and I'm nice to you, I give you positive feedback. You do it another, and I kind of shut you out, or I give you negative feedback, I punish you. Transactional leadership is incredibly common in all forms of sport, business, it doesn't matter, because it's a lot of people's default. People default to, if I'm getting the behavior I want, I should reinforce that. If I'm not, I should punish that. And they think that that's, an appropriate way to positively influence a team or a person towards an outcome. And it turns out to not be. What you really need is these four things. And if we look at this on a sort of a grid, the leaders who tend to be very engaged and very effective in the research are likely to be transformational leaders. So people who take the approach of what was on the previous slide. Leaders who are very engaged but are much less effective tend to be transactional leaders. So transactional leadership kind of has a ceiling to it, especially when when things go poorly and you're not getting the results that maybe you want, and people start to disengage and become demotivated because you've based everything on an incentive model where it's good gets you this, bad gets you this. Below that, you have toxic leadership where there's actual like emotional harm and things like that going on. That's a very engaged person, but totally ineffective. And then of course, laissez-faire leadership on the other side where you're just not engaged. And of course, as a result, you're not going to be effective. So leadership does play a huge role in the environment. If you want to set up a culture of success, these three factors all have to be considered very carefully. They all have a very strong effect. If you've got the personalities you need and you want in the group, and you've set up an environment that you think leads to success, but then you have toxic leadership or transactional leadership, it's not going to work. You need all three pillars working together. And that's why it's so challenging to get from disorder up to a collective approach. Now, at the very start of this, I also said the key questions that I asked were, where are we going and why are we going there? And so I wanted to share this as sort of a final slide, because this is a representation of our vision as a team. And it took a long time. It looks simple, but it took a long time to get to this because there's a lot baked into it. And it's our way of addressing and kind of visualizing those two questions: where are we going and why are we going there? When it comes to vision, the key to a great vision is to make it visual, right? It's in the title. So if you want people to feel inspired towards a destination, show them what that destination is. For us, we chose Mount Fuji because we're going to Tokyo. And so we called this the Road to Tokyo for our team. And then we use kind of these little mini peaks along the way as milestones and stages within our vision. And we gave them titles, and all of those titles had words like earning. Well, they all had earning in it because that was, again, a key part of our vision. Everything had to be earned, right? Nothing was going to be given to us. So we had to earn our habits, we had to earn our identity as a group, and then we had to earn our opportunity when it came to our qualifier in Belgium. And then the final step was at the very top, and this is our purpose. Earning history is our team's purpose, right? We want to work really hard for it because that's when things feel the best, right? we also want it to be history because there's so many people who came before us in the program who worked really hard and did a lot of earning themselves to help us get to this point. It wasn't so long ago, in the early 2000s, where it was an absolutely absurd vision to try and even qualify for the Olympics. Playing for a medal at Tokyo 2020 would earn us history, literal history in this program. So what you see here is kind of a combination of our compass, our North Star, which is our vision, made visual with our purpose baked into it. Like what in our heart makes us want to climb this mountain, because it's going to be a long, long journey. So when I go back to this, it seems quite simple on the page, but getting from disorder to collective, and in my case, trying to go from individual to collective, has a lot of steps in it. Those steps are, if you want to start somewhere really simple, it's those 3 key questions. And then once you move beyond that and you get into actually establishing a culture shift, it's really key to look at the personalities in the group, how that's going to affect the dynamic, the environment that you set up, and the way that your values are communicated, not just stated, but communicated, and then the type of leadership that is involved and what that leadership has to do to continue to propel the culture forward. All 3 of them make a big difference. So that's, I'm 6 minutes shy, hopefully, for some questions, and I'm happy to go over if others are with the questions, but you see our email there. If you have any additional questions or thoughts that you wanted to reach out on, please do so. And Vicky, I guess I'll pass it over to you if you don't mind, because I can't see the questions on my screen.
Yeah, of course. Awesome. First of all, thank you so much, Bryce. That was an incredibly engaging session. I was captivated, and I know I'll be watching that recording over and over again. And everyone, you can look forward to having a video recording of this session as well, so that you can go back and kind of revisit some of those insights there. So there are a few questions, Bryce, if you don't mind.
Yeah, there we go.
Staying on. Can you hear me? Can everyone hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, awesome. Up in Northern Cape Breton, so you never know. Sometimes the signal's a little unstable. But we did get a few questions here in the Q&A box. Some of them are from earlier in the session. So just let me know if you need clarification. The first one here is from Bill McGregor. He said, I've only ever seen a 5-factor model with neuroticism, vice, emotionality. What is the source for emotionality in this version?
Yeah, so they are one and the same, Bill. We just use the phrase emotionality because it's friendlier. Basically, it's more user friendly. It felt like neuroticism has a natural kind of negative connotation to it, and when people score high on it, the assumption is that this is bad and you want less of it. And we want to make sure that there's neutrality in every trait. So there's pros and cons to being high or low on all of these traits, and neuroticism was the one that seemed like people had a hard time with that. So we just switched it to emotionality from a sort of a branding standpoint.
Great. That is awesome. That answers that. Another one from Bill McGregor. How do you normalize conflict? It will happen because stuff is important. If stuff wasn't important, there would be no conflict. How do you normalize and deal with it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The first thing that we did was various educational opportunities on creating psychological safety within the group. So we started from a place of psychological safety, educated on what that was. We shared a really key example from a book called Influencer, The New Science of Leading Change. And they give a case study where a doctor is about to do something in a hospital, and they don't wash their hands. And there's a lot of disease going around because of this very issue at the time. And there's a nurse in the room trying to decide if she should mention to the doctor that she's noticed that since he's come in the room, he or she has not washed his or her hands. And he or she, being the nurse, doesn't know if this person did that before they came in the room. And then they outline the three most common outcomes of this scenario if that nurse does choose to speak up. And it almost turned into a role play exercise where you start to see, okay, this is an uncomfortable situation. We'll define it as some amount of conflict. It could lead to more conflict, but how do we kind of escape, or I'd better use embrace this type of opportunity where this doctor and this nurse are more aligned and trusting of each other coming out of it than less. And so we roll through sort of the types of responses and the options and the reactions and the emotion associated with that. And once we did some practical examples and role play like the one I just described that were unconnected to our team, so we totally depersonalized it, used different contexts, we found that people were far more likely to identify these types of moments where, someone's just speaking up because they think it's important, and how we handle this moment of conflict is really key. So that would be the main thing that I could share on that.
Awesome. Thank you, Bryce. One from Jason Seeley. Does the Innerlogic platform plot big five results of a team for coaches to have a clearer picture of compatibility versus balance on the team?
Good question, Jason. Yes, we do. So our consulting services are more advanced than our tech services at the moment. But our tech services, we've got this MVP out there, or more of a first version, and it does plot the big five, and it gives you team analytics on the big five with detailed descriptions and tendencies for each. The newer product, which is in the works right now, will have awesome visualizations and information on compatibility versus balance. So likeness versus disparity within the team. Absolutely.
Cool, that's great. One from Lily Chalupowski. There were plenty of examples of togetherness, linking arms, semicircle meetings. Do you have suggestions for doing this remotely?
Yeah, absolutely. Good question, Lily. So we do something at the start of all of our meetings, whether it's a meeting like literally the day of the biggest game that we've played in the past 4 years, or the beginning of a meeting in the middle of a practice, 3 years out. We do the same thing at the start of every meeting, and we call them energizers. They're like fun little, tasks or games that sometimes it's as simple as charades or heads up or things like that. Since we've had to move to all remote meetings on Zoom, we've continued these energizers, and the effect of them is awesome. Like, number one, you're trying to get people energized. Number two, sometimes at the start of a meeting, you can kind of like feel, you could cut the tension with a knife. And we believe that, like, for humans to thrive together, it has to be a super vulnerable human space. So what we do is on Zoom, like right at the start of a meeting, we'll spend 5 minutes and we'll have like a funny questions to ask each other. And then we'll do like 3 breakout rooms. And then we'll come back and say, who had the funniest answer? Or we'll do like a scavenger hunt where we name 10 items and you have to go find them in your house. And the first one back wins. And one of them is really embarrassing. It's like, who found the blank? And then they show, because what we're trying to achieve is energy and humanity are the two things. So when we all come back from that, we go, you know what? We're all just humans. We're all capable of having a good time. And it's really not that complicated. So we try and start off a meeting with that vibe. And I find it to be very effective. People are just more willing to speak. They're more willing to engage and ask questions. And kind of loosens everything up.
Awesome. Next question. That was a great question, Lily. We're all dealing with that right now, so really, really awesome. Jason Seeley, when creating team values, in your opinion, should this be a top-down, bottom-up, or integrated approach?
This is a good question because it just highlights something that was like a total omission from the presentation. Yeah, definitely not top-down. I think I tried to make that inherently understood, but I missed the mark. You want this to be integrated. So bottom up doesn't work either, in my experience. Top down creates transformational culture right away. So transactional. If you want a transactional culture, establish values at the top and then tell everybody else what they are and expect them to believe in them. That's a transaction, no question. Bottom up is a transaction the other way. And you need your leaders and your coaches or your management team to also believe in where we're trying to go. So that transaction doesn't work either, even though you may go, well, you know what, our people believe in it, so we better believe in it too. Eventually that's going to catch up with you because you don't actually believe in it and you weren't involved in the process. The integrated approach is absolutely key. When we establish our values as a team, everyone played the same role. Staff, support staff, coaches, management, players, everyone was in the room, everyone's doing it together, everyone's sharing examples of what they thought was a key value, kind of on a level playing field. So integrated approach is definitely the answer to that. I see the last one there, Vicky. Can you share more examples of how you integrate mindfulness into workouts? Yeah. So as I said, we put mindfulness into warm-up. So to be more specific, they're going back and forth doing some stretching. And we have a thing called touch the line because touching the line represents our devotion to attention to detail. So you don't get to the other side and almost touch the line or miss the line or just turn around without looking at the line. If our task is to go side to side with our foot touching the line, we touch the line. And so what we did was we associated, and when you touch the line, you're going to keep your foot there for a second, and you're going to do 5 mindful breaths, anchoring your attention on something about your breathing. We also integrate breathing into workouts in the gym. So there's a lot of time between repetitions, and there's some value in athletes using that time to just socialize and chat with one another, but that doesn't need to take up all of that space. So for every few exercises, we'll integrate some mindfulness between reps, and sometimes even integrate some mindfulness cues like, let's do some confidence building internally where you start to visualize the next repetition, and could you do it harder than you did before? What would that look and feel like? And so you're just sitting there as an athlete, spending that 30 seconds in that space and then kind of getting back into the flow.
Awesome. So I think that wraps up everything for questions today. And we're about 6 minutes over, so being mindful of people's schedules and having to get back to work. Thank you so much, Bryce. And Mike, for your silent contribution, moral support.
Thank you, Vicky, as well. Thanks for facilitating this and having us.
Of course. On behalf of DNS, it's been awesome to have you and great to have you as a new member as well. Looking forward to sharing a lot more of these webinars and your insights on leadership with our membership and our community. So thank you a lot. I'm going to stop the recording here, and I will send that out, like I said, to everyone after. If you wouldn't mind completing our survey, we do pay close attention to that. If you want to see more from Innerlogic, that's a great way to tell us. And I'll include your admin at Innerlogic email in the follow-up email as well, Bryce. So thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your Wednesday, and we'll hopefully be seeing you again soon on webinars like this one. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
All right. Bye.